Well, thank you for your interest in the webinar today. My name is Joan Popolo, Executive Director of Action Innovation Network. We are a collaborative network of technology business incubators and other entrepreneur support organizations based throughout the greater Boston and New England region. Our network supports startups developing technologies in the industry sectors of life sciences, clean tech, robotics, ocean, marine, and maritime, and advanced materials. We provide a suite of resources for international startups that are looking to explore the Boston innovation ecosystem as a place to grow their company in the U.S. This is the first in a series of 5 webinars on topics of interest to international startups as they look to Boston as a place to grow their business. I'm just going to go through a few items before we start. All attendees will have their audio and video muted. The presentation will run for about 45 minutes, leaving about 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. If you have a question, please submit it in the group chat on your screen, and at the end, Abby will answer those questions. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the Action website for future viewing, along with the slide deck that Abby's presenting today. So today's webinar, an introduction to the Massachusetts startup ecosystem, is presented by Abigail Barrow. Abby is the managing partner of Cambridge Innovation Partners, a consulting firm that helps startups find global and local resources for their success. Abby has previously served in the University of Massachusetts President's Office, is the founding director of the Massachusetts Technology Transfer Center, and formerly as the TTC as the interim executive director, Office of Technology Commercialization and Ventures. Prior to that, she served as managing director of the von Liebig Center at the University of California in San Diego, supporting the commercialization of research being performed in the UCSD Jacobs School of Engineering. Dr. Barrow has a PhD and a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Go ahead, Abby.
Okay, so thanks very much for that very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk to you today about the Massachusetts startup ecosystem. I've got a lot of information here, so some of the slides I'll go through pretty quickly. There's a lot more detail on them, but the slides will be posted and available. So if you want to go back and review, you can see all of the information that's included. What I'm going to do is a very, very rapid overview and a bit of a history of Massachusetts, where we came from, some of the main elements of our technology ecosystem and what's here, and then finally how to navigate and find the resources that you need if you're a startup, entrepreneur, or emerging company. So this is just some basic statistics on the state. As you can see, we're up in the northeast corner of the state. We're a relatively small state. Our population is just under 7 million. We're the 15th largest state, but that only represents about 2% of the population of the US. We're a really diverse state. As you can see, over 1 million people in the state were foreign born, so about 15% of the population was actually born outside of the US. We're also a state that has a very, very high level of education, and in fact, for the age group of 25 to 34, over 50% of that age group have a bachelor's degree or higher. Economically, we're very active. 543 billion, and that puts us somewhere between Sweden and Belgium if we were a country. We're also a very high exporting state. So just a little history, and this always fascinates me. Pilgrim Fathers arrived in Plymouth in 1620, so almost 400 years ago. This was really the first active and successful colony in the New World, in the northern hemisphere of the New World. 10 years later, they founded Boston, so they found a much better harbor further north from Plymouth. 1635, they found a school. 1636, they found a university. And then they were very, very lucky in that John Harvard, who was a clergyman from England, He died, but he left his funding, his money, and his library to what was then the new college, the university that they had set up. And they named the university after him, Harvard College. They also renamed the town from Newtown to Cambridge. But that early economy really focused on agriculture, fishing, cod was incredibly important, and trade. One of the rather strange parts of history was, for England at the time, their major need was actually masts for ships. They were busy fighting the Dutch. And so one of the big exports at that time in the 1660s was actually masts for the ships to supply the British Navy. Come the early 1800s, industry really starts to move out of Boston. Boston has a couple of rivers. The Charles is a pretty small river as these things go, and they really moved out of Boston to get to the better sources of water power. Important for many industries. One of them was the armory industry, and in Springfield, Massachusetts, they really developed what's known as the American system of manufacturing. Really important because up until that date, everything was customized and really made to fit, but this enabled them to make rifles and guns where the parts were interchangeable, completely changed the way that things were manufactured globally. Lowell was also founded. This became the real center of the textile industry, and by the 1850s, it was the largest industrial complex in the US. Throughout the 1850s up to 1900, continuing innovation in many areas. The first use of anesthesia. We got into developing lots of sports. So basketball, volleyball, and the golf tee were all invented here in the 1890s. And probably one of the most important things was in 1900 when Gillette patented a new safety razor. He not only changed the way that people shaved, but he also created a completely new business model of selling a razor for a small price, but then selling razor blades over and over and over again at a much higher price. So a completely new business model from that period. Just a few other fun things that have been invented in Massachusetts from the mutual fund and the microwave oven. First venture capital fund was founded. That was actually a Harvard business school spinoff. Polaroid, the first organ transplant. VisiCalc was the first spreadsheet and really enabled people to use what became the desktop top computer. Zipcar was one of the first sharing economy companies. Facebook, which was again a spinoff from Harvard, later relocated to the West Coast. And even more currently, CRISPR-Cas9, which was an invention from outside, but what Massachusetts did, or the Broad Institute, was really the first mammalian genome editing using CRISPR-Cas9, which enabled it to be used in human research. Just to give you a flavor of kind of the transformation that happens in Massachusetts, this is a building in Cambridge that's used by Sanofi. It's one of their big lab facilities, and they have a lot of their business development and venture capital outside of this building. It's a reused building. You can see that it's not a new building, although inside it's very, very modern. This is what it looked like in 1919. This was the first vertically integrated manufacturing plant in the world, actually. It had a railroad siding on the side. They brought in parts for Model T Fords, and this is where Model T Fords were assembled in Massachusetts to supply the Northeastern market. After Ford moved out, this is one of the other companies that moved into that space. So this was Polaroid that again was manufacturing in that plant. So this just shows the continuous reinvention, reuse of the space that we have, but also of the brain power and the manufacturing capabilities that we have within the region. I'd like to just get into a little bit on sort of how people look at industry independence and ecosystems. If you look from medieval times, you've seen historical clustering of trades and crafts, and while sitting next to your competitor might seem to be not an obvious move, there's a lot of benefits from proximity and collaboration that comes from clustering of trades. If you go back to Eisenhower right after the Second World War, he talked about the military-industrial complex and how they fed off each other, not always in a good way. Later on, people started talking about the triple helix in economic development of university, government, and industry. If you go to MIT now, you can do programs, their REAP program in economic development, where they work with regions all over the world. They talk about a 5-stakeholder approach with government, entrepreneurs, university, corporate, and risk capital all being involved. And then if you go to a book called The Rainforest, that looks at actually 12 facets to the innovation ecosystem, and they diagram it out like this, with all the different both soft and hard surfaces, but most importantly, the great knitted togetherness or interconnections between all these different organizations. And that's some of what I'm going to talk about in the rest of the program. So I'm going to give you a little overview of some of the main pillars here within Massachusetts, and then I'm going to talk about some of those organizations that are more the softer organizations that tie everything together. So the base for a lot of what goes on in the state is really our universities. We have a very strong group of university. Obviously, Harvard is the oldest university in the US, but MIT, University of Massachusetts, Tufts, Brandeis, all of these are very, very strong research universities, but also very strong educational establishments that really push out a lot of highly qualified students and researchers who work in the community. There's also a very large number of liberal arts colleges and state colleges and community colleges that also supply other levels of education to support the ecosystem. Very, very strong group of medical centers. As I mentioned, this is the state where anesthesia was first performed. That was done at MGH, still the leading recipient of NIH funding. But we have a lot of other specialized hospitals as well. Children's, Dana-Farber focused on cancer, and they receive an enormous amount of federal funding as well as corporate funding in order to do research and perform really world-saving technologies to support patients. We've also got a collection of rather interesting federal and state labs that work in very specialist areas. So NADIC is a very old lab. They actually do all of the work for food supply for all of the military, so a lot of nutrition information, but also food packaging and food preservation. One of the other really interesting centers that we have is the Wind Technology Testing Facility, and this is actually a picture of them testing a turbine blade for the clean energy industry. This is one of the few facilities in the world where you can put a turbine blade that is several hundred meters long, and then you can test it until you destroy it. Really, really interesting work, and is part of our development in the clean energy sector. What we've also seen really in the last 20 years or so is the development of new research centers that are much more multidisciplinary and that also really support the development of our industry. So I mentioned earlier the CRISPR technology that came out of the Broad Institute, which started off as an MIT Harvard collaborative. The Mass Green High Performance Computing Center was actually a center put together by all of the universities and the hospitals because they needed a center that would really focus on their computing power needs, and they worked out that doing it together they could get a much better center. And then fairly recently, the Bill and Melinda Gates Medical Research Institute set up a big center here to work in many of the diseases in public health. So TB, diarrheal health, those kinds of issues are being worked on at the Gates Institute. We like to compare ourselves with other states. This is actually some data on how we compare to other states. What you have to remember is that we are a very, very small state compared to all the other states on this list. So we do incredibly well in securing federally sponsored research funding. And we also do very well in translating that from basic research into products and into startups. So this is the number of startups that are spun out of the actual institutions. There are, of course, many, many other startups that are founded every year that have formed not through licensing technology from the institutions, but from people who have ideas and come out of other companies. Just to look at a couple of our clusters in a bit more detail. We're known globally for our life sciences cluster. We have about 13% of the US drug pipeline and 6% of the global drug development pipeline. So about 1 in 20 of every new drugs being developed within the world is being developed within Massachusetts. So huge number of drugs being developed here, as well as medical devices. And the other thing is that while we're not known for pharmaceutical manufacturing and biomanufacturing, we're actually one of the world leaders. What's pretty less known is that we're still an enormous leader in the IT sector. We have a lot of companies, 160,000 employees. By comparison, in the life sciences, we've probably got about 80,000 employees. So in employment terms, it's about twice the size. And we have very high concentration. And many of the big companies that aren't located here have research centers here in order to take advantage of the products. What's interesting with the IT sector is that it's very diverse. We've got a lot of things in a lot of different areas. And in some ways, that comes from the integration of the IT sector into the other industry verticals that are here. So the IT sector works with healthcare, they work with the financial services industry, they work with the entertainment industry, they work with the travel industry. We're not usually known as a travel location, but if you've ever used TripAdvisor, that's a Massachusetts company. So we have a very great density of innovative companies in IT that really collaborate with other innovative companies in different sectors, and that creates more solutions that go on to create world-beating products. One of the things that's really happened is that big companies outside of the region have seen the concentration of academic research and people, and they've decided to locate their research centers here in order to take advantage of the region. So a lot of big pharma companies, but companies like Amazon, Google, they set up here. Schlumberger, which is a big oil company, has a facility here. We're not known as an oil region, but Schlumberger came here because they could hire people with mathematics degrees. So a lot of very big companies come, and these are really the reasons why they come and set up. They want access to ideas. They get ideas through research collaborations with the academic institutions, but also working with the entrepreneurs and other startups around. The other most important thing that they're after is talent, because they can come to Massachusetts. I think they can find highly skilled people who are open to new ideas and can really cross between different disciplinary boundaries and really help them develop new products for their corporations. One of the other things that Boston is a center of the finance industry. So we developed the original mutual fund. We are a major financial management center. So after New York, a lot of money gets professionally managed here. So State Street and Fidelity are two of the biggest money managers in the world. And combined, they manage over $5 trillion in assets. They're, of course, investing in very big companies, although Fidelity in particular does have a venture fund and does actually do some active work with startups as well. As I mentioned, we invented venture capital. We're very proud of inventing venture capital and the model, and we continue to be the second largest center of venture capital funds in the US. More recently, we've had quite a few family offices set up here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those later. And then finally, we have many, many angels and many angel funds. So those are successful entrepreneurs who, having made money from a startup or maybe several startups, decide to continue to invest and work with really early stage companies and have an involvement both from a personal perspective and management perspective, but also from an investment perspective. So our venture funds, they're pretty traditional. They manage funds for investors, so they work with the big pension funds. They work with the big money managers. They expect a return within 5 to 7 years. And they're really working on putting money into really high, what they expect to be high yielding investments. We've also attracted, like we have the big corporate research centers, some of the corporate venture funds. So these are large companies that decide to invest in companies that might be synergistic to their business. So they come in, they put actual money as well as having a relationship with that company. So GSK, GE, J&J, these all have corporate venture funds that are based here. Of course, they don't solely invest in companies here, they invest globally, but this is where they call home. So just a sort of an example of one of our venture funds, Highland Capital, now based in Kendall Square. They're a very big fund. They manage over $3.5 billion in assets. They make pretty big investments. They've also been very successful. Of their investments, they've had over 46 IPOs and 122 acquisitions. So that's what they need to do within their 5 to 7 years to get the money back for their investors. Their partners work very, very closely in the development and execution of a deal. So if you get an investment from Highland, one of their partners will really be sitting there, be on the board, and be working very closely with you. Investments include companies like Carbon Black in cybersecurity, Level Up, which is a payment, a mobile phone payment system, Love Pop, which is one of the cutest MIT spin-offs, is actually a very high-end greeting card company. Harry's, that goes back to shaving. They sell razors, but again, it's a completely new model of the way of selling razors. And Rent the Runway, which is a clothing company, but again, is a completely different way of basically renting out clothes to women who want to have a continuously changing wardrobe. So a lot of different companies, but a lot of companies that are really changing the way that people think about how they do business and what they do with business. On the angel side, we have angels that invest individually, but we also have a lot of angels that cluster in groups and invest together. They might specialize by sector or by type. Just one example is Mass Medical Angels. They have about 100 members. Combined, they review and screen deals. So you apply to the angel group and a subset of the angels will look at the deal and decide whether to present it to the rest of the group. If they decide to go further, they will also team and share their due diligence. Angel groups don't invest in huge numbers of deals per year. So Mass Medical Angels probably invest somewhere between 3 and 5 deals a year. And they will also syndicate deals with other investors, both angel groups as well as professional investors and VC firms. If you need more information on them, Mass Medical Angels, but if you Google angel groups in Massachusetts, you'll come up with a complete list of the groups that are here. I also mentioned briefly family offices, and in some ways this is a hybrid between a venture capital firm and an angel group, in that these are firms that are set up by individual, extremely wealthy families that want to target specific areas of interest. So we have several family offices that have been set up. I picked Gurnett Point. This was founded actually by a Swiss family which built a very big Italian company, Serrano, exited from that and now puts a lot of funding into developing new healthcare startups. They have a much longer investment strategy than the traditional venture capitalist. They were also able to hire very, very senior talent. So actually, Gurnet Point is led by the former CEO of Sanofi. So very high level support and knowledge of the pharmaceutical industry running that family office. So what I've talked about really are these very big pillars that hold our ecosystem. But the important thing is that they're not alone, and there are lots of organizations that kind of weave through them to join them all together. So startup incubators, trade organizations, even government really work to sort of pull everything together. So we're not just having separate big organizations that don't interact. And these organizations that weave those threads together are really important to make us a very strong ecosystem. As you can imagine, it's a very large and complex ecosystem. And so there are many players and programs that are there to help you find your way through and find the right resources for you to really work out what you need and who to talk to. And so part of what I'm going to talk about is where you might find those guides and networks that will aid you in the process. One of the important things is space. We have a lot of startup incubators and co-working spaces, both in the middle of Cambridge, all around Boston, and then all around the state in other major cities and towns. These can vary from very basic space with almost no equipment, just desks, to very well-equipped wet labs with the latest technology that you need in order to develop your new biotherapeutic. Of course, price depends on where you are, what location there is, and what services they offer. And some of these incubators are for-profit, some of them are not for-profit. It just depends how they were set up and what the motivation was. A few examples, Cambridge Innovation Centre is probably one of our biggest. They have 3 locations in Kendall Square and 1 in Boston, and almost 1,500 startup companies and bigger companies located there. Lab Central is actually a non-profit. They set up really to support the wet lab space. Again, they're in the center of Cambridge, very, very expensive space, but they have worked out deals with large pharma so that you can get supported space there. Greentown Labs was really a grassroots enterprise started by a group of clean energy companies that wanted cheaper space and to share some equipment. That's now a very big center with over 100 clean energy companies. I'm going to talk a little bit about North Shore Innoventures in a minute, and then the Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship is a university-based incubator down on the South Coast in collaboration with UMass Dartmouth. So North Shore Innoventures, as the name suggests, they're up on the North Shore. They focus on life sciences and clean tech, so they have lab space available and shared equipment. Like many of the traditional incubator models, they actually do a lot in business support and strategy, so they are there and have staff to help you think through your strategy, but also for you to help find resources. Through some funding by the state, they also have access to local colleges, facilities, and libraries. So if they don't have the equipment, it's possible that you can find within the region other people who have that material that you might use. For international companies, they also have a soft landing program. So if you're coming in from overseas, they have programs that will help you find resources and really help you adapt to being in Massachusetts. They're a non-profit, but they've also received significant state funds in order to build up the center. There's also Action. So Action is sponsoring these seminars, but a little bit about Action. They're really a network that works with all of the business entrepreneurs and support organizations. So they're an organization that cuts across these. They help them The incubators share resources and best practices, but as an entrepreneur, they can also help you find the right incubator for you. So if you come in and you're looking for an incubator, you're not quite sure where you should locate, Action is an organization that can help you with that. With all these big industry sectors, obviously we also have a lot of trade organizations that work with them. And this is only a very, very partial list. So people like MassBio, the Northeast Clean Energy Council, the Tech Leadership Council, they specialize by industry. They help build an industry community, so they will have everybody involved from really early stage startups to the really big companies. They organize a lot of networking events. They also do a lot of lobbying. And many of these also do startup specific programs. So they will have specific activities and support programs that will support early stage companies in that industry sector and help them network with the bigger players in the field. Government is another important part of our story. Government often isn't seen as a major player within ecosystems. In Massachusetts, it really has been. Massachusetts government invests very heavily in technology-based economic development. They have funding programs. So Mass Ventures is actually the state venture fund that will invest in startup companies. Mass Development is actually the state bank, so they do a lot of lending to bigger companies, but they have an emerging technology fund that will actually do very easy loans for startup companies where they see development opportunities for the state. In industry, probably the best known is the Mass Life Sciences Center. This is funded at a very high level, about $100 million a year in both capital and tax incentives, and then in actual industry support. So a lot of broad programs, including training programs and also some startup programs. The Clean Energy Center, again, obviously focused on clean energy, but they also have several startup grant programs. So if you're in clean energy and you locate here, you're eligible to apply for those. And they also have an investment program. Pretty also importantly, a lot of the government funds also support many of the programs and incubators around the state. So very big involvement and commitment to supporting technology-based economic development. So for our entrepreneurs and startups, there's a lot of assistance in training, networking, and mentoring. And again, this is really not a complete list, but just a sample of some of the types of programs that are here to support early stage entrepreneurs as they're starting to think about what they're going to launch as a company and then where they need to go to find resources. So the Capital Network focuses on helping startups learn and find funding. And MassBio has their Mass Connect program. That's all life sciences, but that's a mentoring program if you're accepted into it, where they find experienced life sciences executives who will help you think through your company. West is a program that's focused on women in the enterprise of science and technology, helping skill build and start companies. Venture Cafe is a weekly program, really just to help entrepreneurs network and meet with people. And then the incubators, many of the incubators have their own programs and activities to help both people within the incubator as well as virtual tenants access these things. The other types of organizations that are often forgotten in entrepreneurship and startup support are actually the law and accounting firms that we have here. They work and they frequently hold seminars and other programs, but they'll also give quite a lot of time one-on-one to really help entrepreneurs think through what they need to do. So if you're a startup and you have legal questions, chances are that you will find a lawyer or an accountant here who will help you with those questions, have a coffee with you, listen to your story, and then really help you think before they start charging. So they're very much here trying to build relationships. Obviously, what they hope is that you grow to be a big company, that you'll remember them, and that you'll use them as your professional service provider. but they really do invest a lot of time and a lot of effort into helping early stage entrepreneurs. We also, like many other regions, we have a lot of accelerator programs. So Mass Challenge is probably the biggest that's most globally known. It's a very, very big program. They have over 3,000 applications. They end up with 128 finalists. And then at their final dinner in October, they'll give out almost $1 million in funding, probably for the people that participate. They get a lot of mentoring support and they get space during the program as part of the accelerator. But if they're a winner, they get enormous media and PR coverage and a lot of connections. Techstars is also an accelerator. It's a for-profit group, very highly selective, but great network that they bring into you. And then Cleantech Open, which is a national program, but the Northeast region is run out of Boston, and that focuses on really clean energy and environmental technologies. But very good programs in order to really help you accelerate and help you think through what you need to do and really spend 4 or 5 months very, very focused on developing your business idea and getting those connections that you need in the region. A couple of notes if you're not here, but you're thinking of coming. Start by reading about what's going on. There's several things that you can subscribe to for free to get updates. So the Boston Business Journal has updates in different tech areas. It's free to subscribe to the basic outline of it. Exconomy also has a Boston, it's a Boston company, but they have a Boston-focused newsletter that comes out daily. And again, it gives you updates on what's going on in companies here. And all of the trade associations also have newsletters. And again, most of those are free to sign up for. And finally, there's a ton of things on the web. One of the most comprehensive is the Hitchhiker's Guide to Boston Tech. But again, many of the incubators, many of the industry associations also have big lists of resources on where you can go and find activities. So I think with that, I'm going to close and open it up for questions. You're still on mute, Joan.
If you have any questions, I hope you'll type them into the chat box and we can answer them here. Abby, anyway, I'd like to thank you for that wonderful presentation. You've touched on a lot of different areas and woven them together very well to tell the whole narrative of the Massachusetts innovation ecosystem. So thank you for that. I do want to let you know of some upcoming events that we will be having, Action Innovation Network. We're going to be continuing our series of webinars, and our next webinar will take place on June 25th, and the topic will be the power of your marketing collateral for fundraising. You will find this located on our website under webinars, and you could register for the next webinar there. In addition, if you are an international company that are looking for further ways to engage with us, we do have what we call the pre-landing program, and you can find more information on our website about this as well. There's an application online to sign up that way. So I am seeing some questions coming in. And the first question is, based on your experience, Abby, do angels and VCs invest in foreign companies?
It depends. There's certainly some investment in foreign companies if they have a location here or if they relocate here. The group of VCs, though, that will invest in foreign companies really are the corporate VCs, just because they've got such a big multinational presence. They will invest. Some of the bigger VC funds will invest outside if they see a big opportunity. Several of the VCs were investing in China. Some of them have partners in Europe. But really the investors want to be able to touch and feel the investment and have pretty regular communications. So it's hard for them to invest in companies that are located too far away. And that particularly goes for the angels. They want to touch and feel and work closely with their investment. So they're the least likely to invest in an international company unless the company sets up and relocates. And many of the VCs actually do work with startup entrepreneurs from outside the region, and they do get them to relocate just so that they're closer, so they can work with all the resources and so they can support them.
Thank you. Any other questions today? Here we go. What degree of maturity would you recommend for a European startup to consider exploring collaborations with stakeholders in Massachusetts?
I think you should probably come fairly early and just have a kind of initial look. I think for many companies, a US strategy is really important, and to come and just see what's going on can really help. I work with a lot of scale-up companies, so they've got a little bit of funding. Maybe they've got 5 to 10 employees. They've usually got a fairly finished product and some revenues, and now they're really thinking about how to push forward and really develop into a more global company. So to actually set up, I think you want to be slightly later stage, but I think coming to visit and coming either for a conference and then spending some time meeting with additional people, I think you want to do that fairly early on, and particularly in the very early stages when you're still thinking about your development and your final product, it can really help you to come very early.
Here's another one. How important is it that startups IP is located in UE or USA? EU or USA?
So IP, depending on the industry, is important. It's obviously much more important in the life sciences than in IT. What investors want to see is that the IP is well protected, and so they really don't mind where it's protected or where it originates from, but they want to know that whatever country it's protected in has laws to enable you to really fulfill that protection that the IP offers. So if you don't have a strong legal system that enables you to basically sue people who are infringing your IP, that becomes an issue. But if you have coverage either in the US or the EU, that is fine for most of the investors. What they want to know is that you've got very good coverage. They're probably more interested in what IP attorneys you've worked with, who's actually done that. They're probably going to be less impressed if you've done the IP yourself or if your brother-in-law did it. They want to know that somebody who's really skilled at protecting inventions has worked on the IP.
Still have a few minutes for a couple more questions if any come in. I just want to clarify one thing for some of our attendees who may be in other countries, and that is the definitions, I guess you'd say, of accelerators and incubators. And I think often the definitions are switched between our countries and foreign countries. Just want to make sure that you're aware that an incubator in the US is a longer term proposition. So you would be in an incubator for maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years, depending on sort of the status of your company. And an incubator will provide regular mentoring and events and networking and community for which to participate. The accelerators, on the other hand, are considered more shorter term duration opportunities for you, and they're run in cohorts. So that's the major difference that I wanted to convey that way. I know oftentimes, like I said, there's confusion because the definitions are switched in other countries.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. And in fact, I sometimes think that an accelerator is much more like a business plan competition, in that it's much more competitive. You have a lot of people coming in at the beginning. It's a absolutely defined term. And in some ways, an accelerator is a business plan competition with space. So most of them have some space, not all of them, but it's really space, mentoring, and support, but absolutely a fairly defined time span, and not continuing support or tailored support as you develop your startup. So I think that's a very interesting clarification.
I'll just throw one more question out here for you, Abby. What would you say are some evaluation criteria to consider when seeking an investor that's a good fit for someone's startup?
Oh, so investors have to fit with your motivations and goals. So they really have to fit with your business. They have to have knowledge of your business. One of the stories that I think is really interesting is on eBay. So eBay, they actually raised some venture capital money when they first started. They actually never used that money, but what they used were the connections that came from the VCs and the strategic support in growing the business. So what you want from an investor is really somebody who can help you think through the business, help grow the business, help make the introductions to you to grow the business. So they've really got to be a very, very strong partner. You're also going to be spending a lot of time with your investor. So it needs to be somebody that you don't always get on with, but that you have respect for, that you can work closely with, and that you can really get their strategic input, and who will listen to you as well and take your input on what you think the company should be doing. So it's something that really takes a long time to develop, and you have to have a lot of mutual respect. So I think those are the big things. Finding investors is a very hard business. As a lot of people, what people like to say, a contact sport. You really have to meet them, get to know them, and really make sure that you fit in with what their objectives are. If you have different objectives, then it's not going to be a happy outcome, because you're going to be fighting all the time about what you want and what they want out of the investment.
Well, if there are no more questions, we can wrap it up for today. And I want to thank you again, Abby. And I want to say to all of our attendees that we'll be following this up with an email to you with a link for the recorded webinar and also the slide deck, so that you can take some more time to go through it on some of those items that you may want to look into a little more deeply that Abby had mentioned. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you found it informative.